So for our project, we researched and analyzed Chinese rhetoric. We looked at three different types of Chinese rhetoric. And the first, which is the one I'll be discussing, is Confucian rhetoric. So let's start by looking at the Analects, which the article that talked about Confucian rhetoric that we were assigned talks quite a bit about. This also does have some outside information. The references are provided later. I had to look outside just to get a little more information about what really the Analects was. But the Analects was a book written by Confucius, and it's a collection of sayings and ideas, basically, that Confucius wanted to look at and kind of focused a lot around. The article really talks a lot about the reading of the Analects, specifically how Western philosophers and Western researchers have read the Analects over the years. It identifies how most people read the Analects and read for verbal communication and how verbal rhetoric is used, which the article discusses of how that's really an incomplete reading of the Analects because Confucius is really big on all forms of communication, not just verbal. So below you can see a quote from the article about the Analects. It basically just kind of describes how the Analects functions. It talks about how it heralds a rhetorical tradition that dominated Chinese and other East Asian societies for 2,000 years. So in terms of how we read the Analects is actually going to be really important because if we don't read it correctly and we get that incomplete reading just from looking at verbal communication that's discussed in the Analects, we can't really understand how rhetoric worked in China and other East Asian societies for almost 2,000 years. So it's pretty important that we read the Analects for more than just verbal communication and how that worked in Chinese society. The article also talks about how Western philosophers and Western researchers and academics have looked at Confucius over the years, specifically in terms of Confucian rhetoric, compared to a lot of Western rhetoric and lots of Western philosophers. Confucius was a lot less systematic than they were, and the main theme that the article focuses on is that there was no developed system of argumentation. Now, if you look to the quote below, this is a quote from the article, where they were talking about Socrates' view on communication, where it says, besides the system of argumentation, there is no other system of human communication that would deserve the name of rhetoric. So basically, these are kind of two contrasting viewpoints between more Western looks towards argumentation and rhetoric and Confucius, to the point at which where Western philosophers feel that there needs to be a developed system of argumentation in order for rhetoric to function. Confucius didn't have one of those. So going down towards the how in the Western society we view rhetoric and communication, especially in terms of argumentation, we like it to be organizational and verbal. So basically that is very much not what Confucius did in the Analects and a lot of his other teachings. So it differs a lot from how Western philosophers view rhetoric and communication. And because of that, a lot of people either one, take a wrong look at Confucian's writings and teachings and misinterpret them, or two, kind of criticize them because they aren't as organized and verbal based as most Western analysis of rhetoric are. So in the book, The Analects, Confucius derives basically and defines the appropriate use of language. This includes things such as virtuous speech, trustworthy speech, upright speech, cautious speech, and correct speech. And the article doesn't go very in depth into any of those, but these all describe what moralized language behavior should look like, those 5 different types of speech. Well, the article doesn't go in depth onto what each type of speech, like what these different types of speech mean. It does go a bit into depth on how oftentimes these are categorized, these Confucian not philosophies, but these Confucian teachings are categorized as philosophical views instead of rhetorical perspectives. The author of the article we read said that they should be categorized as rhetorical perspectives because that's what they are really meant as when Confucian wrote them. But most people who have analyzed the writing have categorized them more as philosophical views, which the author critiques pretty heavily in their article. One thing that Confucius talks about a lot, and the article goes pretty in depth on, is ritualization, which is a primary definer of Confucian rhetoric. So this is probably a really good thing to talk about, as it was a large part of his teachings and writings, especially in the Analects. So basically, it clarifies, and the article is very clear about that words and verbal communication are one of many parts of ritualization, and that all ritual is communication. So any form of ritual that you do will always fall into the wider scope of communication. But overall, it's just trying to make it clear that ritualization is not just verbal, it can be through actions and writing as well. It also moves on to discuss how ritualization requires a high level of societal bond. Basically, society has to have a realization of a common bond among the members of the society in order to participate in that ritualization. It also says that it exists beneath hierarchical structures. So basically, this ritualization exists beneath those structures, and it kind of portrays it in a way that it's supposed to be under the surface, always continuing, and just kind of separate from hierarchical structures, always there. Contradictory to that, it seems to me at least, it goes on to discuss how rituals are always endorsed by an institution. This was a very interesting perspective for me, especially considering how it talks about how ritualization always happens beneath hierarchical structures. It was very confusing and kind of contradictory, it seemed to me, that they then have to be endorsed by the institution in order to be effective, according to Confucius. At the very bottom, you'll see a quote that just kind of defines what ritualization is. It's a stereotyped sequence of activities involving gestures, words, and objects. So that goes back to what I was talking about as well, gestures, words, and objects. So it's not just through verbal communication or words, but it can be many different things. So here are the references for the Confucian section of our project. And now we'll move on to the Taoist form of rhetoric and communication within Chinese rhetoric.
All right. Now to the Taoist section in the Chinese rhetoric. I furthered my information in reading the book, The Lao Tzu Ching. The Taoist rhetoric is represented by two philosophers by the name Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. It is both referred to as Taoism and Taoism. They both mean the same thing, just two different words that you can use it. The Lao Tzu is said to be around the time period of 500 BC and Zhuangzi a little later than that. The dates aren't stick in stone. Tao Te Ching translates to the classic of the way and its virtue. The main thing the Tao focuses on is the concept called the way, which in the right-hand picture is the Chinese symbol of how it looks. The way is known for the Chinese as a moral concept. It is the way of law and human development. It focuses on the concept of way, which is translated to mean non-action, meaning they let things happen on their own. Taoists want to reach an equilibrium in their lives because it creates a balance, and that's what they strive for. Some Taoists devote their lives to going to monasteries to worship those that they must or that they want. They are really committed. They go like 3 times a day or more every day in the week. Others just go to temples to complete rituals that their families have done before. To the right again is a picture of a Taoist monastery, and you can see how many people are there, how much detail is put into these monasteries, the color. The other picture is known as burning incense, which every Taoist should do every day at their altar that usually most of them have at home. Taoist beliefs, they find it really important keeping a balance, like I said, so they follow the yin yang, as well as finding the balance through meditation to find their qi. The qi is said to be in your body, which is looked at to be a power of your own. It is also called the quality of spirit. Taoists believe in 5 basic movements: in spring, wood peaking, summer, fire, autumn, metal, and winter is water. Then earth is most powerful and appears before each of these seasons begins. In the picture, you can see the symbol under each word of how Taoists use it. Taoism is a polytheist religion. They think the universe can be divided into 2, human beings 1, and the gods being 2. They have thousands of different gods that all have different powers. Um, some are said that they can grant wishes. In temples, different deities are put in there for a certain reason. When a Taoist needs to pray for something, they must choose the correct deity so that deity can make it come true. All right. The Taoists believe in the yin yang, like I said. In the second picture, you can see how we usually see it. That's how we've seen it before. And in the second picture, or the first picture, you can see how the Chinese see it. The tiger is the yin, which is the female, and the dragon represents the yang, which is the male. To maintain your qi, keep it healthy and a balance between both powers. That's what you have to be able to do is keep a balance. Lastly, here's just a picture of how some deities might look. In the left picture, there's many others. That's just one example. And then to the picture of the right, the Taoist people, they're praying or honoring the deity. That is just one example. This was just part of the Taoist culture. Now, Seb will get into the worldview of Taoist. Bye.
All right. So first, I'd like to thank Kaylee for introducing Taoist rhetoric, and I'd like to continue it a little further. Now, the first thing that I'd like to make clear, and I pulled this image right off of the website, Ashlink website, is that Taoist rhetoric is skeptical. There is skepticism within the Chinese rhetoric. And what I'd like to make clear is I want to know how or why. What causes the skepticism? In order to do this, there's a couple questions I'd like to ask. What is going on in Chinese rhetoric? What has been going on? Before we answer that, I want to ask another general question with quite a few answers, but this is the ones I'll go with. How is rhetoric studied? In the West, you might suggest rhetoric is a separate entity studied in communication courses. You know, this is what we're doing right now. We're just kind of studying rhetoric in its form. We're just kind of studying it separately than anything. Although it's suggested that this is not the case in the East. Rather than studied generally, it's something that had been used, considered so valuable that it had been intertwined within politics, religion, and philosophy. And because of this, some rhetorical elements have been overlooked. Now, why? Why is this the case? Now, before we can do that, I'd like to ask another question. Were there any influences? And I'd like to say yes. As we were recently introduced already by Kaylee, Lao Tzu, as well as his student Shuang Su, came up with a few practices within the Chinese culture that actually emphasized a few other things. What they ended up emphasizing, and I'll just kind of paraphrase, eloquence, argumentation, and even speaking in general is highly depreciated, disapproved of. Much emphasis on the value of not seeking knowledge outside of acquiring knowledge for oneself, which resulted as well as becoming the admonition to avoid critical thinking, and is heavily honored preceding from authority. So basically, Asian rhetorics alluded to ancient authorities rather than their own questioning and analysis. No one has been able to come up with their own ideas by listening to the teachings and emphases from Lao Tzu as well as his students. Now, let's look at it from a different angle. Consider translations. Take a look at this quote. The usual problem with accuracy of translation is ever present. Consider how you might go about translating a word you do not know. What would you do? Now, personally, I don't know Spanish, and I'm in a position in my life where I need to know Spanish. And when I don't know something, I usually go to my mom or I'll go to Google Translate. And the thing about Google Translate is that this is the very thing you should not do. And it's because if you were to translate a word from Google Translate and then reverse it, you might not even get the word you started with originally. And that might become a reality of when it comes to translating words with individuals. When you have one person who can't speak the language of another and relies on a translator, you become reliant to those that devoted their time making the translations. And the person and the middleman might not actually, for their own intention, tell you what the individual originally wanted to say. It's a reliance that actually has become quite disturbing. It makes you wonder where is the fine line between paranoia and the honor code when it comes to translating. These are some of the ideas that I pulled from Vernon Jensen's Rhetorical Emphasis of the Taoism. And this is the quote I'd like to sum up when it comes to considering rhetorical skepticism through his perspective. Taoism represents the element in Chinese society that served as a counterpoise to pedestrian routines in the daily grind of human existence. With this, I'd like to ask you a question. Have there any been misconceptions caused by the influence of another entity? If so, what were the effects? Now, I would like to shift things to a whole different way. Now, this is the first time I was ever introduced to it when I started studying it currently, and now I'd like to introduce it to you guys as well if you didn't already know it. Take contronyms, a word with two opposite meanings, and compare that to homonyms, words that have the same spelling and pronunciation but different meanings. Now, in the world, let me give you an example of one that is both. The French term sacré, which is sacred or accursed, it basically is a term where it relies heavily on the individual and the context that it's being spoken in. And this is actually something that is very similar to German terms, Vergenben, which is pardoning or poison. It makes you really question what on earth it is that the person is trying to say. I would not like to be told the word Vergenben thinking I've been pardoned when he's actually trying to poison me. Now, let's pull some information out. The Chinese character yi can either be conciseness, change, or constancy. Now, let me compare that to a very influential text within the Chinese culture, which is the Yi Jing, a famous text. If you didn't already know about the Yi Jing, you can either translate this as the book of conciseness, changes, or constancy. If you didn't already know information within the Chinese culture, you wouldn't know exactly the texts and characters that make the translation that you wouldn't normally work with as compared by others. It's something that would definitely be confusing and you wouldn't know what to do. In other words, be skeptical of. These are the ideas that are pulled from the Tao and Logos notes on Derrida's critique of logocentrism. And how I'd like to summarize it is, language and labor are alienated from the mouths that speak, the hands that work, and the highly operative organs of the individual. The thing is, not only can it depend on the translation, but it relies on who speaks it and what they intend to say. As I said, here are my sources. And now, I'd like to introduce you to The Rhetoric of Mao Zedong by Jake and Lauren.
Hey guys, this is Jake Dennison here, and I'll be doing the last part of the Chinese rhetoric, and I will be doing the rhetoric of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong's, just a quick background, he's regarded as a cultural icon and a national hero by many Chinese people to this day. His view on rhetoric has had the most impact and influence on the transformation of China. This was represented through his writing and speeches in the modern era. And he likes to present himself as a patriot and a moral leader. Looking at his rhetoric, he was very effective in instilling Marxist and Leninist ideology and social change, and successful in inculcating a proletarian consciousness for the development of a new communist person. His discourse of hope provided a rhetorical vision for China's transformation from a Confucian society to a socialist country with a communist ideology. His rhetoric has also empowered many ordinary people while simultaneously oppressed and violated the human rights of millions of others. Some major characteristics: he's manipulated the desire of the Chinese people to engage in self-criticism in order to become a good person. His use of language was always very clear, vivid, and forceful. And using traditional Chinese rhetoric techniques, such as metaphors and analogies, was his way. He used plain and metaphorical language to explain complicated ideas on issues of the people's concerns. The effects of Mao's Rhetoric was through his moralistic and nationalistic rhetorical appearance. He consolidated his power. He eliminated descendants. He vilified his enemies and elevated himself to the status of a living god for the Chinese people. They all looked up to him at the time. And because of this power, he was able to bring China to independence and give China a foundation for a socialistic economy. He was also praised for making China one of the military powers in the world and for his fearlessness of Western sanctions and the Soviet pressure. So during all of this, madness, he was always there for his people, not only his people, but just overall, all of China. Some more effects. His rhetoric united the Chinese people. This was big. This is why they all think of him as like a godlike character. He moved China to a different social structure, and he also reshaped the cultural habits and ideological beliefs. And before Mao, the Chinese citizens lived in a strict and social hierarchy, which they all were just not happy in. And this is why Mao became so popular, is because of his communist ideals and his idea of how the government should be operating. And after he took over, his rhetoric gave the power of instilling a new consciousness and a new hope for the future. Some major rhetorical themes. There were 4 major themes found within Mao's speeches and writings, one of them being the moral legitimacy of Marxism and Leninism, and number 2 being the importance of serving the people, number 3, the use of criticism and self-criticism, and number 4, big one, is nationalism, which was very important to him. Next is the legitimacy of Marxism and Leninism. However, to make a foreign Western radical ideology accepted in China, Mao had to present a convincing argument that Marxism was indeed applicable to China's situation, which was tough for him. I don't think a lot of people were aware of Marxism at the time, so I think it was definitely a challenge for him, but it did end up working out. Mao would reinterpret and adapt Marxism to the Chinese social and cultural context measured by the Chinese value system. This allowed him to incorporate traditional Chinese values of hierarchy, loyalty, self-cultivation, and then this also, all in all, paved the way for his political persuasion. Thank you, and we'll now move on to Lauren to finish the rest of the slides. Thanks.
Hey guys, it's Lauren Garman, and I'm going to be finishing the Mao Zedong rhetoric. So one of his main themes was the importance of serving the people. Throughout his writings, Mao emphasized the message of serving the people wholeheartedly, including by ordering party members and intellectuals to abandon their elitist attitudes and mingle with the masses. He stated, as a quote, all our literature and art exists for the masses of the people, and in the first place for the workers, peasants, and soldiers. He also devoted a number of his speeches and writings to explanations of how to use their language, the peasants, to identify with and persuade them in general. Another theme is his use of criticism and self-criticism. The new communist person was to be selfless, loyal to Mao and to the party, and willing to sacrifice for the country. This process involved a diligent study of moral exemplars, consistent self-introspection, and a practice of criticism and self-criticism. Mao's hope was that by implementing constant criticism and self-criticism, people could develop their abilities to self-correct and self-monitor their personal thought processes, and also see the reformation of their consciousnesses. In a typical session of criticism and self-criticism, intellectuals and party members were expected to denounce their so-called selfish thoughts and immoral behaviors. Another theme was nationalism. Storytelling was one of the rhetorical techniques Mao used to construct Chinese nationalism. Mao reiterated throughout his writings and speeches that the Chinese people must strive for an independent, democratic, and prosperous China. And to do so, Mao contended China must follow a path of socialism. So this is where ideas of Marxism and Leninism go into play. For some Chinese people, such rhetoric firmly boosted Chinese national pride by generating a longing to restore China's glory of the past and by intensifying desires to exert more power onto the world. So Mao's legacy in the post-Mao era. Mao died on September 9th, 1976, bringing an end to the turbulent Cultural Revolution. New leaders of China faced the challenges of recovery from a devastated economy and the devastation of the death of Mao. The succeeding leaders did define the rhetorical situation at the same time, made to include pieces of Mao to maintain overall political legitimacy. They also did this to try to be a part of Mao's legacy. As much as new leaders were said to have attempted to compare to Mao, their speeches deviated from Mao's rhetorical style in several aspects. So the first, they did not contain radical words and abandoned Mao's revolutionary ideology, particularly his divisive rhetoric of class struggle. Instead, their speeches called for unity rather than division and harmony rather than conflict. So this division that Mao was talking about was the proletariats and the bourgeois. And so in conclusion of the Chinese rhetoric, Confucian rhetoric is the rhetoric that's characterized by a humanistic view of language, persuasion, and argumentation. Taoist rhetoric aims to achieve balance or equilibrium in one's personal life and in governing a state. And the rhetoric of Mao Zedong, Mao's rhetoric, had the most impact and influence on the transformation of China and the Chinese people throughout his writings and speeches in the modern era. Thanks for listening, guys.